Welcome everyone, and in today's video we're going to talk about automation. It's going to be a bit of a long video, but it will be very useful to you because once you understand all of the technicalities of creating automation within your ecosystem, then it will unlock unlimited possibilities of things you can automate to make your life easier and your network more secure. So as you begin to work with the FortiGate and as you expand your fabric, your ecosystem by, for example, adding a Forti switch or adding a Forti AP and other products, this is when you unlock the ability to build automation between those parts. One of the most, I would say, challenging part about automation is to come up and figure out what will I automate? What playbook will I build? And so to be able to do that, I think that the best way is to ask ourselves some questions. So the first question I always ask myself is, what would be the most important criteria of a log or an event that would make me want to take an action on it, or that would be of critical importance to me as an administrator? And one example of that would be a log that has the threat level score set to critical. So if a log is critical, that would mean that there's a very high likelihood of that this log means that my user has been hacked or is infected. So critical log, for me, I would consider that important. So that's one example. Let's use that as an example. So once we've decided which criteria we want to use in a log or an event, then what we do is we need to ask ourselves, what kind of action do I want to take on this? Do I want to isolate the user in quarantine? Do I want to get notified? All of that stuff. So in my case, yes, I want to get notification, and I also want to isolate my user automatically if there's a critical event that would occur. And I would consider this applicable and legitimate to do that. And it will depend on business to business. This is a generic example, but for different customers, they will have different threshold. Some will want to be more strict, some less strict. It will really depend on your environment and what you do in your business. The tool we're going to use to be able to do automation is called a FortiAnalyzer. FortiAnalyzer, historically, it has been created as a log server. So it's the Fortinet log server that ingests the logs of every Fortinet product. It started as that, but over time, it evolved as a more mature product that allows us to build automation, and it has built-in rules that will detect malicious events based on the logs it ingests. So it basically has some SIM and SOAR capabilities built into it for the Fortinet ecosystem. So let's dive into it. You need to understand raw logs. So we're going to go in the raw logs. So when you ingest a log, if you click here in the field raw log, so you see here, the raw log is the log that the FortiAnalyzer receives, and then it will parse it and show it to us in a fancy and readable manner. But this is the raw part of it. And this is very important because we're going to need to use those fields. For example, date equal this, DST MAC equal this. So we're going to use those fields to select a trigger, so to create an automation. So for example, I could say, okay, if it's coming from, well, let's use this, this MAC address, DST MAC, if it's coming from this MAC, I'm going to take action. If it's coming from this hardware vendor, Apple, I'm going to take an action. So you need to be able to figure out which property of your raw log that you're going to use to create your trigger. Once you've chosen it, and in our case, we know it's going to be the criticity level to critical, you're going to go in this section, which is called handlers. Handlers is a nice word. It basically means a handler it's the logic that it's the rule and the logic that the FortiAnalyzer will use to create an event. So built in, there's a bunch of handlers that will detect a bunch of malicious things. In my case, I have created a custom one to detect what I want to detect. So here you see, the first thing you need to do is you need to toggle on this switch, so automation stitch. When you enable that, this will allow your FortiGate to see this handler in the FortiGate, and then you can build an automation from this handler. Very important. Then you have to create a rule. So it's going to be the detection rule of our logs. Here you see I've defined that it's going to be a FortiGate log. It will be a traffic log as my main type. And subtype, I said any. It could be any subtype of logs that could happen. Then in the log filters, this is where I create my filters. So you see here I've set threat level. So threat level, it's CR level equal to critical. So in my raw log, I was able to see that it's the field CR level that defines the criticity level. So I said, okay, CR level critical. And also to be granular, I've said policy ID 24 because for this test, I just want to take action on the traffic that is coming from this policy ID, which is this one, this VLAN. Next, this one is going to be important because I've set it to 1, and what this property does is that you will tell the FortiAnalyzer how many times can this log happen before you create an event. So in my case, I've said 1, which means that every time there's a log that fits those filters, it will create an event. So my FortiAnalyzer will be full of event because every time there's a log, it will happen. Sometimes you might want to increase this number because let's say that within a minute, there's 100 logs and it's the same thing. You might not want 100 separate event for this. But for demoing and doing my tests, it's ideal to set this value to 1. Then here I've let everything by default. So we've defined that. Then the notification. So how will I be notified when this handler is triggered? This is where I define my email. So for me, it's going to be an email. You could do SNMP or syslog alerts if you want to. Once we've done that, we need to define what is critical for us. What kind of logs do we want to be categorized as critical? And the way to do that is to go in your FortiGate, and in the logs setting, you can set the threat weight. There's a bunch of default values, but you see here, critical, you have to decide what kind of logs you want to consider as critical or not. So for example, here in the web filter, we might want to consider a spam URL as a critical event. We would configure this, and this would show as critical in the FortiAnalyzer. In my case, for my tests, I've added the application for application control, the application category remote access to critical. So I'm going to use a remote access software to trigger a critical event in my FortiAnalyzer. Let's do that and we'll see how it shows. So here, I just use AnyDesk in this virtual machine. I will trigger traffic, and this will appear in my FortiAnalyzer. So if we go in the event monitor, you see there's an event that appeared. It says critical. This is my endpoint. And look at this column handler. This is my custom critical severity handler that has detected this. So this is your first validation that your handler is working. You should see an event being created if your handler is working. Once this is done, we're going to go on the FortiGate in the automation section. So to create an automation, you see there's trigger and action and stitch. A stitch is composed of a trigger and an action. So we have to define a trigger. In the trigger, if you have a FortiAnalyzer, you'll see there's a section where we see all of the handlers that we have enabled, the little toggle I showed you earlier. When you enable this toggle, the handler will appear as an available trigger here. Once this is done, you have to build an action. An action could be multiple things, but in my case, I'm going to use a CLI script. I'll show you what I've done. There's a very important thing that we need to understand, and that we need to see the first test we need to do when we want to build an automation is to validate how the FortiGate receives the raw log, the raw event from the FortiAnalyzer when there's a trigger. Because I've noticed that the raw log that we're going to see in the FortiAnalyzer will not have the same properties and fields as the log that the FortiAnalyzer sends to the FortiGate. And when I was trying to build my script, the variables were not working. So I figured that I built this automation, which says basically, whenever this event handler triggers, just do the action and send me an email. Send me an email with the log, with the raw log. This is the variable log. If you do that, it will give you the log. So it will send me the log by email, from where I will be able to read and see which property of the log I want to use and select in my script. So now I will just trigger again the log. I'm triggering the log, and you'll see it will show as a trigger count. Okay, it triggered. So I got the email here. You see, this is the raw log, and those are the properties that we can use as dynamic objects in a CLI script. So in my case, I want to put my computer in quarantine when there's a critical event. So I need to put the MAC address in quarantine. This is how it works. So I'll find here epmac equal the MAC address of my endpoint, which means that I will use the epmac property in my script. My next step, I will disable this stitch. I will edit this one to show you. So you see the trigger and then the action. I've built this. So those are the CLI commands that you will normally use to put an endpoint in quarantine. But you see here, I've added this variable. So log.epmac. So whatever you put after log dot something, it will be those fields here that we received. So you could take anything there and create a dynamic variable in your CLI script. So in my case, I want to quarantine the MAC address. I'm going to put this right there. Once this is done, there's a few configurations that we need to do to make sure that the quarantine works well. First, we need to enable this set bounce quarantine link enable. What this does is that whenever the FortiGate will put an endpoint into quarantine, it will bounce the port of the switch, which means it will disable and re-enable the port of the switch to force the endpoint to request a new DHCP address so that it can switch VLAN quickly. And then the quarantine mode, I set it by VLAN. I want the Forti switch to use the VLAN, switch from one VLAN to another for my quarantine purposes. Then we have to make sure that the switch ports are properly configured. In my case, it's port number 6. So this is my untagged VLAN. This is the VLAN it's on. And you see here, I have to tag the quarantine VLAN. And what is this VLAN? This VLAN is automatically created by FortiLink when we manage a Forti switch. So I just select the default VLAN and I have to tag it so that the FortiGate can use it when needed. Once this is done, I have to define a firewall policy rule for knowing what will happen when the computer is in this VLAN. So I have created this policy here, which I say, okay, I will give internet access to computers that are in this VLAN. I still want them to have internet access, but they won't have access to anything else. So this is how I've built that. You could choose to block internet to your users or only allow access to certain things. Maybe you have an MDM software or a remote software that you use. You could only give them access to your remote software so that you can connect in their computer, and that's it. So you do what you want with the firewall policies. Here, this switch, this software switch, this is for the Wi-Fi. I might do another video on how to do quarantine with the FortiAP's access point. Now that the firewall policy has been defined, we're going to trigger the automation and see what happens. I will enable the automation stitch. It's ready to fire. Let's go here, trigger traffic. Let's do a ping and see what happens. And if we, if we go here, we're gonna wait. You see it triggered. Now I lost remote access. Ping stopped. If we go in the firewall, in the dashboard and the security, we're gonna see that we have something in quarantine, and this is my computer. CyberThin is quarantined. If we look at the DHCP server, so you're gonna see that the quarantine VLAN has a DHCP. It's the FortiGate that does it in my case. So we see that it gave this IP address to my computer that is in the quarantine. What I can do if I want to free up my computer, I can just delete and remove it from the quarantine. I do that, and I will disable the automation to get back my access, and it should get its original IP back once the port of the switch has been bounced. That's it. We got back our access. So you see, those are pretty much the steps that you have to take to build automation. There's infinite possibilities of what we can automate. If you have any ideas or you want to share what kind of automations you have done in your ecosystem, share them in comments in the chats, and I would be happy to read them and to learn. Maybe you've done something very interesting. That's it for this video. You can follow me on LinkedIn if you want notifications for all my future videos.